Hey there guys, welcome to week 15 here in your research design course. We are going to be going over what ends up being our last lecture. It was going to be our last lecture no matter what, but you've decided not to have class next week. So next week we would have just really been going over some things for the capstone. So I'll touch on that really briefly here, and then we'll jump into chapters 18 and 19 in your research design textbook. So I just want to say regarding the capstone, remember that you need to find at least 9 randomized controlled trials for 3 different diagnoses in DSM-5 that deal with CBT as one of the treatments. So remember, in an RCT, they're typically going to be comparing CBT to another type of treatment. Sometimes they'll do a wait list, but they're often going to be comparing it to another treatment. So even if you have, CBT versus DBT versus ACT versus whatever, just make sure that CBT is one of the treatments. So it doesn't have to be CBT and no treatment. So it's okay if there are multiple treatments, just as long as CBT is one. So 3 for each of those at least, and you should be good to go there. Please do let me know right away if you have any questions about that, so we can address those before it becomes too late. All right, and make sure to check your syllabus for the specific day that's due next week. I believe it's going to be day 5. It might be day 4, but just go with what the syllabus says. I won't take your time right now to check that out, but do make sure to look at that. So let's go ahead and jump in now and take a look at communication of research findings here. All right, so a few things we're going to be going over here in this chapter, and also touching on some of this in the next chapter as well. We're going to be looking at what are some of the ways that we go about communicating the findings of research. And so really what this means for most of us here most of the time is that since our primary focus is not on doing research but consuming it, this is where we're going to find research. But it's also helpful for us to know how our articles put together. So we've done a lot of work looking this semester at how our studies put together in terms of design. So how do we select participants? How do we randomize them into groups if we are doing randomization? What's the difference between qualitative and quantitative? So we've looked a lot at that, and now we're going to take a look in our last lecture here at what happens after all of that is done. How do we put it all together? What are the different segments of an article? And what is the thought process that goes into that? And so that's helpful for us as readers, because when you're reading a study, you'll probably have some critical thoughts about it, and it's helpful to have some context for what went into that. So you might say, oh, well, gosh, they didn't talk about XYZ factors, and I'm really interested in those. Well, it may be a space limitation issue, and they addressed what they could, and so maybe use that author's note at the beginning or the end of the article to get in touch with them and get more information, perhaps. So hopefully this gives us a little bit of context for what goes into creating an article. All right, so when we are putting together a manuscript, and your manuscript is just what gets submitted to the journal for publication, really what we're trying to do is convey what were the methods, why did we choose those methods, and how well did they work, and what did we find. So really the central goal of preparing your manuscript is just to say, here's what I did. It's helpful because as a reader, you want to know, okay, yes, you came up with this supposedly interesting finding, but was it a useful finding? Does it really mean anything? Is it valid? So when we looked at all those issues of reliability and validity earlier in the semester, that's why. So that people don't just write, depression is linked to name any random factor, right? That's great that you said that, but why? How do you know this? Can I trust what you said? So we want to convey what we did, very precisely what we did. And the reason that precision is important is because it's also helpful for replication of studies. Now, again, these aren't the most popular studies to do. There's limited journal pages, and they'd like to have the newest, hottest topic out there rather than redoing something that was done a decade ago. But it's still helpful to have those studies out there. All right, so if you are going to be writing a study, if you're in a good journal, they don't want any fluff. If you're in a high-impact journal, meaning that it's got a high readership, it's got a high reference or citation number, so meaning that anytime people publish a new study, have they referred back to articles written in that journal. So those kinds of journals, they don't want any fluff. They want you to get down to business and just be concrete, be very specific about what you've done, just the what did you do, how did you do it, less about why. The why is important in your intro section to a degree because it conveys the relevance of your study. But after you've set up that this is, yes, important to do, just get down to telling us why. Not a lot of fluff. We don't need to know your thoughts and feelings about things or your reactions to things, just what happened and how it was done. Be as objective as possible, meaning make things measurable. Again, looking at, can someone else replicate this if they wanted to? And be precise. So instead of saying a few or many of the patients or subjects did this, instead be very precise so that we know exactly who did what and when and where and how. All right, so we want to be really clear about the details of the study. So we've talked about why that's important, but we also want to have not only a description of what we did, but also the explanation for it. So a little bit of the why here. And again, not just for the study, but getting into the details of the study. So why was a particular method selected? Why was a certain population used? Why were subjects randomized or not randomized into different groups, right? Was it a convenient sample? Not only what did you do, but why? That's the explanation. And then in terms of contextualization, this partly is about our introduction section, but also our discussion section is going to get into this as well. So why are we interested in looking at this? How is this going to change our culture, our societies, the science of psychology? How will it change the way we look at relationships or the brain? So always do what you can to make it in context for the reader. That helps them to want to read it more. Okay, so we're going to kind of breeze through some of the sections of an article here, and we'll just take a quick look at some things that are relevant for each section. So the title, while this isn't really a section of the article, it's one of the most important things about any particular study. So in part, this helps people to find your article. So, I mean, as we just mentioned, you guys are going to be looking for randomized controlled trials that involve cognitive behavioral therapy. So when you go into PsycInfo or Psych Articles or ProQuest or PubMed or any of the journal databases that we're going to use to find these articles, you'll type in those terms: RCT, randomized controlled trial, CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and you'll probably include your diagnosis as well. And you'll get thousands of hits most likely, and then you'll have to use other keywords to narrow it down. So you can search just by title, which is about the narrowest way you can search. But it's also likely to yield very clear results for you, things that you'll likely want to use. So if you only get 3 and 2 of them aren't really all that relevant, you'll have to broaden your search a little bit more. But the title can be really helpful in that sense. So it's usually going to be no more than 10 or 12 words. It's going to be very direct, very clear, and it's going to describe what your article did, what you looked at, whom you looked at, and what you studied. And you want to be careful to avoid the kind of blog mentality when you're writing an academic article. You don't want to get into the yes or no questions. Is it important for students to really attend school? We don't want to get into that, right? Well, yeah, okay, so what are you really trying to say here? How do I know whether I want to really read your article or not? Did you find something interesting? Or do you just have a catchy blog title? So we're looking to gain academic readers here, right? We're not looking for somebody thumbing through Facebook and just wants to click on something to read for 90 seconds while they're waiting for the bus to show up, right? We want something that's substantial here. So the title is pretty important. But probably even more important than the title even is your abstract, because a lot of people are going to search for abstracts. They're going to search, and in the little drop-down menus in ProQuest or whatever database you're using, you can select abstract as a place to search for the key terms. And a lot of people will say to search the abstract because it gives you kind of the highlights, all the highlights of the article. It's not going to give you everything that was found, every result, but it'll give the most salient features of the article. So it'll talk about who was studied, how they were studied, and what the relevant findings and conclusions were. So you only have a couple hundred words in most cases to do this. So you have to be pretty specific. And again, no fluff. Not looking for fluff here, just what is going to draw the reader in and make them want to read and hopefully eventually cite your article, because those citations end up being something that can yield prestige and help your career along. All right, the introduction section, we've talked about this a little before. So the purpose of this is to convey the importance of your study. It gives a little bit of background information for what's already been done, maybe what some of the holes are in the literature, and you can talk about how the current study, your study, fits in. Now, I would highly encourage you to read chapter 18.3.3. Just read that paragraph 17 times. Read it until you've got the whole thing memorized. It's just a really important one because it's important to think about an academic journal article as different from what you might do for a class paper where we say, review 3 articles and summarize them, right? Summarizing articles is different from doing an introduction to a research study. So an introduction to a research study, you should be introducing your study, not these other people's studies. So really what you're doing is you're building a case for your study. So the names of the authors, the studies that were used, they're just little pieces of the puzzle. It's not the main focus. So try not to focus on the names. So read that paragraph multiple times till you get this idea about how to go about setting the stage for your article. All right. So in terms of tension here, sorry, I just got an email that distracted me. It was actually from one of you, so I'll address that in a minute here. But tension. So in order to get people interested in your study, it's important to create some tension, to say, here are these 2 different sides of the story about this particular issue we're going to look at, and this study will help to resolve some of that tension. So like anything else, we want to get a good hook, create some drama, right? Like any TV show is going to do. They're going to, in their teaser trailer, they'll show you multiple sides of a story, and you have to watch to find out what the result is. So that's what we're trying to do in our intro section, set the stage. Now we get to the main sections of the article that really do talk about what you did, not so much what other people have done. So in your method, we know what goes in here. Who did you study? How did you study them? What groups were they in? What devices did you use? And you're also in this section not just going to talk about those devices, but how did you select those? So what was your rationale for each of these things? Why did you use X number of groups? How did you put people into those groups and why? Why did you choose and use the participants that you did, and why did you use the measures? And what Kasdan's going to say about the measures is, don't just say, well, so-and-so, Johnson & Johnson in 1997 used this same method, so we thought we'd use that one too. Because 20, 30 years ago, methods may have been used because there was nothing else available, and now there is something else available, right? So it may be outdated. So it's always important to not just say, we used it because somebody else did, but to say we used it because it's been demonstrated to be valid and effective in recent studies. No other effective measures were available, right? So give more of a reason than just so-and-so already used it once. In terms of the results, we want to give an overview of what we found, and then start breaking it down into very specific numbers, very specific data. So to do that, we're going to start with our hypothesis again, which we initially laid out in the introduction section. So we say, here's what we were curious about, just in case you forgot in the last 8 pages, and then give your statistical analyses, and you've likely used multiple measures to take a look at your data, and then you say, here's what we found. And so this is where you're getting into your relationships, your correlations, but you're kind of building a story as you go here. So we were interested in this, here's what the numbers say, here's what we think that means, here's what the relationships were. So once you've done all that, then you get to your discussion section, and this is where you're really trying to tie all the pieces together. So it's not just about numbers anymore, but you're saying we're taking our numbers and we're putting them in the context of what we told you in the introduction section. So it's really a continuation of that introduction, because we're giving an overview of the findings, but then we're relating them to what was already talked about, to any theories or prior research that's been done. So we're going to talk about how the research findings added to the literature. So what was the new information that we came across here? How is this helpful? But then, of course, we also want to talk about what are some of the weaknesses or the limitations in the study. Because not only does this show that we have some self-awareness and that we're not narcissistic enough to think that we've created the perfect study, which would be great, but probably unlikely to ever happen. it also shows that we're thinking about how could we improve this the next time. So we're always trying to say, if we're putting together a study, what's the best way I could do this? How can I fill all of the holes ahead of time? What other problems might come up and how could I address those? But it's impossible to think of them all. And that's actually, I mean, just part of how research works is that we read a study and we say, what didn't go as well here? What could we change? And then we do that. And then someone else does that to our study. And then the dominoes keep falling and we learn more. So out of those limitations, you might come up with some future research ideas. So what would you suggest to some of your readers about what they could do taking your study and building on it to further the field? So again, really, as you're putting together your paper, your article should tell a story. So there should be some continuity. So you're not just having an introduction section that's this isolated island of information. It flows into your methods section. So you're saying, here's what we know. And then your methods say, well, based on what we know, this was our question we were trying to answer. And here are the people that are going to help us answer that question. Here's the best way we could think to answer that question. And then the results are, here is the answer to the question. And then your discussion is, here is the context for the answer to the question. Right, so it's all kind of building on itself. So it's very purposeful. Each step has meaning and is thought about ahead of time, at least if we're doing it the right way. And then, of course, there's a clear ending to it. So we come to the results in the discussion, but it's all the continuation of a journey that started a long time ago in the introduction section, which for a lot of articles could be several years prior. So once we've got a manuscript put together, where do we want to put this? So there's lots of journals out there, thousands of journals in psychology alone. And some of the best journals are actually not even going to be psychology journals. So, for instance, I think I've mentioned to you guys before that I enjoy listening to podcasts and reading articles from a group called Reasons to Believe, or RTB. So they're a science faith integration group. And they take... they look at Science and Nature, which are probably the two biggest journals in the sciences, whether social or hard sciences. And then they also look at journals that are specific to their subfields of specialty, so astrophysics or microbiology. And what they'll do is they will take the bigger journals, Nature, Science, etc., that have really high rejection rates, 90+% rejection rates for manuscripts. And sometimes they'll find psychology literature, and though there are no psychologists on their staff, they'll find these studies to be interesting and talk about them. But they're not from a psychology journal. So it's important that we not just look, say, to APA journals, even though APA does have some great journals and they're very highly regarded and well cited. It's important not to just look there, but to think a little bit more outside of the box. There are some journals that now are completely online. There are even what we call open access journals that just anybody can get into. So I think earlier in the year I linked you guys to a book review that I ended up doing that got published in New Mail Studies, which is an open access journal, meaning that there's no fee for people to access it. You just hop online and go to the webpage. So that's a different way that was not available 20 years ago for publishing literature. So now print editions of journals are kind of going by the wayside. I imagine in the next 10, 20 years, we probably won't have much in the way of print journals, except maybe those who have specifically subscribed to them, individuals or libraries. And we should also mention that there are international journals. So that New Mail Studies one is an international journal. So not all studies are based in one country, or not all journals are based in one country. Okay, so how do we choose one? If you've got a manuscript you're putting together, some things you want to take a look at. What's the impact factor? Meaning, is there a high readership for the journal that you're thinking about? Who's the audience? So does your article fit with them? So one way to think about that is, whom have I cited in my study? And if I've studied the Journal of Abnormal Psychology a lot because I'm looking at a particular diagnosis or treatment of a diagnosis, and the Journal of Abnormal Psychology has been cited 7 times out of the 50 references that I've used, then maybe I want to think about submitting there because that the readership would be related to my topic. And then also peer review. So this is something that can vary widely based on journals. So the best journals are likely going to have the best reviewers, not in the sense that they're really good reviewers, but that they're prestigious reviewers and experts in their particular field, and they're not just the first person to sign up as a reviewer on for a journal. So if it's a lower impact factor, meaning a less popular journal, fewer people publishing there, less prestigious people publishing there, then the peer review process is probably going to be a little bit easier to get through, which is nice if you're just trying to rack up some publications. But if you're wanting to have publications that are meaningful, that people are going to see, and that will make a difference in your career in some way, if you want to be a public speaker, if you want to kind of get out there on the public speaking circuit, or have a say in what happens in Congress, and get asked to testify before Congress. There are people in my class who have done that. My class from grad school, they're not going to be publishing in the journals that really have to hustle to get people to publish for them. To publish in their journal. So just some things to be thinking about as you would consider what journals to pick. We'll just breeze through these last couple here because it's probably not something you're going to be doing in the super near future. All right. So when you get your manuscript together and you're ready to submit it, there's a few steps to this. So essentially, you pick out your journal and you go to typically the journal's website, and they'll have some instructions for authors, and you will go ahead and upload and usually sign something electronically saying that you've met certain criteria, like that you met the we talked about human subjects review process through the IRB, saying that you've done some things like that they're entitled to the copyright of your article. If you guys recall, I don't know, a month or so ago, I mentioned that I had reviewed a couple of articles for a journal, and that the author had already submitted basically the same paper to a different journal, and it had already been published. And so he had submitted this with a couple of really slight tweaks to the introduction section, and that was going to be seen as a new article, which it's not. It's the same idea with a different cover, different book jacket. So really not a good practice there. So when you do the online submission, you'll often have to sign something saying that you have met these certain requirements. So you go ahead and submit, and then you wait around for a while, really. I mean, it often takes up to a couple of months, and then you get to either accept or reject. Now, there is a reject with revision, so revise and resubmit essentially, which is going to be probably your second most common response. So often you're going to get rejected, most of the time, depending on how prestigious your journal is. And I say most of the time because very seldom do we submit something that's perfect, or close enough to it that it's really ready for submission. A lot of times they'll catch some errors, or they'll say, can you run this kind of analysis on your data one more time? And, can you make sure to add this, that, and the other thing, tighten up your references, whatever it might be. You're going to get some information back. So most of the time you're going to get rejected. So just be ready for that. And I would say, reach for the sky, reach for the stars, and submit a little bit higher than you think in terms of impact factor. Submit higher than you think, because worst thing they can do is say, thanks, but no thanks, pass. Right, and if you read Gadsden, actually, you can hear some worse things, but it's still just a no. So really, the worst message you can get is no, and then you try again somewhere else, and you might actually get a resubmit option with that same journal. So you never know till you actually try. So shoot for the stars on that. But be reasonable with yourself. So if it's your first study ever that you're trying to publish, and it's a minor correlational study, not really high impact for the world, maybe don't submit to Nature or Science. But shoot for something that's a little higher maybe than you think is really doable, just in case. You might learn something through the process too. In terms of the review process, nobody's perfect. Reviewers are not perfect. Our areas of expertise are different. Just as you guys can know by looking around the class and just knowing everybody here has different levels of knowledge about different areas depending on their expertise and their reading level and all of these things. So when I say reading level, I mean how much people have written in a... Okay, I'm going to start that sentence over. How much people have read in a given area. How well read someone is. Sometimes the words just don't come. And I'm going to blame it on it being a sort of holiday today. All right. So there's also just going to be variation among what people will notice and comment on in an article. So you're not always going to get the same review. You might have 1 out of 3 people say, this looks fine, we'll take it. And then 2 out of 3 say no. And then you get rejected. So, it's not always just one person reviewing your manuscript. So not a perfect process, but it's kind of the best we can do for now. So after you get these reviews, Kaz then kind of takes a comedy approach to it and talks about vegan enemas and all kinds of interesting ways to cope. I don't know if I'd recommend the enemas. I've never tried that myself, so I can't speak to its coping efficacy, but some interesting recommendations from him there. Some things you can do something about. Most of the time, not so much. If there was a misunderstanding, you might be able to clear that up. But most of the time, if you get your response, it's just what you get, and you kind of deal with it, and you move on to the next journal if it was a no. There are often recommendations, and try to take those seriously, even though you're ticked off and you're saying, you know what, this was a good paper and they should have taken it. They've probably given you some reasonable recommendations, even if it didn't make you feel good. So try to take those seriously. In terms of other ways to communicate findings other than a research article, you can go to a conference and submit a paper or a poster and get that submitted. So that can actually be part of your official resume. So that's something you can actually do while you're in the program if you're interested. If you're not feeling up for submitting to a peer-reviewed journal, you could go to a conference and submit an extensive case study or submit some kind of correlational research that you're getting started, right? Posters are often for projects that are still in the works or maybe have yet to be published or in press. You can submit papers, and sometimes people will literally read a paper. A lot of times these are more theory related, but so it doesn't always have to be that you're publishing directly to a peer-reviewed journal. All right, so let's move ahead and take a look at chapter 19 here, our final chapter. So looking really more at methodology as a thing broadly and kind of how it's changing. So important thing here, big picture idea for the chapter is that methodology is something that shifts and changes and grows, and that is a good thing for science. So we mentioned from chapter 18 that you may not want to pick a method, an intervention, or a measure just because someone has used it in the past. It may not be relevant anymore. And that's a good thing, right? Because we're getting new and better tools to use in research as time goes by. So there are several components to methodology here that we'll take a look at. There's the research design itself, which we spent a lot of time talking about. There's assessment, different ways of measuring people and situations. Then the data evaluation and analysis that we've talked about a little bit. Ethics, which we talked about last week. And then communications of findings, which we were talking about in chapter 18. So we'll get into these just a little bit here to basically a bit of review, but to highlight why research design is important. So random assignment, randomized controlled trials is where we typically are going to see random assignment. And you guys are going to be doing quite a bit of that, or at least looking for that in the studies that you're using for your capstone. So make sure to read up on those and make sure you're clear on what an RCT is. In terms of running subjects, we've got some new ways that we can do this, and that is good news because unfortunately 60-some% of studies tend to use college students, and in particular new college students. So intro psych students, which if you're a psych major, you're probably taking that your first semester of your first year, if not maybe first semester of sophomore year. So we're talking mostly pretty decently educated, or a lot of their families educated students in psychology, telling us about the world if we were to generalize from these studies. So not a great idea to overgeneralize from college students. The weird, what's the word I'm looking for? Not analogy. And I wish this were a live class so I could say, someone help me out here. Acronym, that's the word. So we're talking about Western, educated, industrialized, rich and from democratic nations. That is what our WEIRD acronym stands for. And so that's typically who is in these studies. So we're not getting people in sub-Saharan Africa or the indigenous populations of Australia. We're not getting people from the inner cities. We're getting kind of your suburban rich folks, and often more white than anything else. So really the samples aren't reflective of the world population, let alone the state population of California or the national population of the United States. So important that we expand who our subjects are. One way that we've been able to do this in the last several years is using online studies. So things like SurveyMonkey. What's the one with a Q? Anyway, it's not coming to mind, but there are multiple platforms now, and some of them are getting pretty sophisticated in the methodology in terms of the way you can ask a question. So now you can type in an answer instead of just doing multiple choice. You can click on a color. You can click along a line instead of just having a typical 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You can click somewhere on the line and it'll get down to the pixel. So you might have 1,000 choices instead of 5 in the same space across the page, across the web page. So pretty cool technology now that allows us to not only access a broader subject pool, but also allows us to have even better, more precise measurement in some ways, and certainly more creative measurement than just multiple choice questions. Okay, so we were talking a little bit about assessment tools here, and so not only are we getting better tools online because we're using digital tools, but also technology has given us better tools to understand the body. So neuroimaging, we've talked a little bit about, that's always improving. The specificity of neuroimaging is always improving. So if we look at functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRIs, it's much more precise, and we can look at real-time data in terms of how is glucose being used in the moment as a subject responds to a particular stimulus or engages in a conversation or feels a certain feeling. Here's a word, right? So we can get much more specific data at a biological level. EEGs, electroencephalogram, same kind of idea there, a little less precise than some of the neuroimaging technology, but that's looking at electrical stimulation. So again, brain activation, we can see what's happening. So much better than just asking people, how do you feel? We can see how people feel when a certain part of the brain lights up. Smartphones, GPS, I mean, these are just ways that we can track people differently. We can use location finder, and we can get big data here, which kind of brings us to 19.2.2 here with data evaluation and interpretation, where because of the technology that's changing, because of the tools we have now, we don't just have to rely on paper and pencil surveys. People can click on something, take a 10-minute survey, and they don't have to, it doesn't cost them a stamp to mail it back to us. It takes a lot less time to just do it on their smartphone while they're waiting in line at Chick-fil-A, and they can take that 10-minute survey and be done, rather than having to sit down, open an envelope, etc. So more data can help us in terms of power, right? So in terms of giving us better likelihood that we will make a correct decision with our interpretation. So whether we're going to accept or reject our null hypothesis, which is what? What's the null hypothesis? Hopefully you're saying to yourself that the null hypothesis means that there is no difference between groups. All right, so everything's the same. All right, little review there for you. Mediator is also important here in terms of research design. So these are things that help explain intervention effects. So really the more data points we have and the more diverse our samples are, the better chance we have of explaining some of the relationships between our variables. All right. A few more slides here for you. Ethics we talked about last time, so want to make sure that we touch on this, but we won't kill it too much because we won't do overkill here because you've heard about this last week. But really, ethics are something that kind of evolves over time. So the APA ethics code gets revised about every 10 or 20 years. They like to take a look at it, and there's a committee that deals with that. So the most recent revision of the American Psychological Association was in 2002, and so they have some standards about research, and I'm sure those will get revised in the next 5 or 10 years here, as more issues emerge, especially around big data, around digital information, right? So lots of rules around HIPAA and privacy and, how we keep data anonymous. So lots of information here that we're going to have to deal with, lots of new issues that are coming up as research methodologies evolve. So as research methodologies evolve, so do the ethics. So it's not necessarily that the principle changes, but our application of the principle can change. So we have to be careful with people's data, and with that comes integrity, right? So am I handling people's data honestly, and am I keeping it private? In terms of communication of findings, we talked in the last chapter about a lot of journals going online, and this is great in some ways. It's great in the sense that more information can get out there for cheaper, and the cheaper it is, the easier it can be for everybody to access it. We've got Google Scholar now, where you can access a lot of reasonably peer-reviewed articles. One of the difficulties with that is that as it's easier to create a journal, the standards drop. So just like anything, if we have lower standards for some kind of criteria group, we'll think about it this way, like college admissions, right? So if we lower the bar for college admissions because we want to give more people opportunities to come to college, or because we see education as the solution to a particular kind of problem, the more we lower the standards letting people in, the more we're going to water down the product, and the more the college degree becomes a high school diploma kind of equivalence, and then it becomes less important. So if we think about and I say that knowing full well that with lowering entrance standards for colleges, we're going to let in a lot of people who wouldn't have been able to get in before because they were in disadvantaged circumstances, or they didn't have support, or whatever it might be. But with those few that come in that really should be there and just didn't have the chance, you're also getting a lot of people who maybe don't, I hate to say belong, but aren't going to be able to make use of the degree. So hopefully that makes sense. Not to disparage anyone, but to explain the point a little bit. So with that said, same kind of thing applies for journals here, in the sense that you can make a study and probably get it published if you want to. It's just a matter of, is it going to be meaningful and contributing to the literature? And the answer for a lot of studies is not very much. The average readership, I believe, for the number of people who read an article, or at least download an article, for the average article that's out there is, I think, 2 or less than 2 people. And really what that speaks to is that there's just a lot of data out there, a lot of information. So that's great and all, but it's probably too much information in some ways, because we just can't consume it all, and some of it is probably not very good information. So it's important that we maintain scientific integrity, and so that's up to the journal reviewers and editors, and we just kind of have to trust them in some ways. But then as a consumer, that's also why it's important that we take this class. So if you have ever thought, and I imagine most of you have at some point in this class, why is this important? Why do I need to be here? I'm a counselor. Why do I need to know about research? This is why, because there's a lot of information, and you want to be able to know, is this credible? Should I take this seriously? All right. Technology's changing. We got online journals, but also bear in mind a lot of good things about online journals too. It's faster, it's cheaper. The review process is not as extensive or not as time-consuming for authors, so it's good in that sense too. So not all bad there. A lot of good that comes out of the digitizing of research. In general, methodologies are always going to be changing. That's good. Collaboration is good at CBU. In ops, actually, Dr. Poole, who is kind of the head of ops, he is the head of ops, kind of second in command to Dr. Ellis in a sense. He has set up our offices so that people in departments are not always next to each other. And the reason for that is to encourage collaborative research and just collegial relationships between people in different departments. And that actually happens. There's a research colloquium for faculty members that 20 or 30 faculty members go to every month or so. And there are people in different departments collaborating all over the place on different studies. So it's really neat. And that's helpful because different departments, different types of faculty are going to bring different perspectives on issues within psychology. So if you can rope in, a sociology professor, a business professor to give their take on a clinical issue or something related to the business of psychology or something, it can yield a really interesting collaboration and new ideas, new ways to study things. So collaboration is important, and at CBU we actually value that, and that's just one way that we, two ways I guess, the colloquium and then different kinds of offices, different locations, but different ways we encourage that at CBU. Methodological diversity. We've talked about several traditions here: qualitative, quantitative, and case study research here. So those are some of your major methodologies there. It's important that we have all of those because, as we've talked about, they build on each other. And we've also got multiple approaches to evaluating data, and that's helpful because statistical evaluations, as good as they are, often don't capture the full picture. It's hard to reduce people to numbers. And so in some ways we need to have non-statistical evaluations of information because the gut feeling, the phenomenological personal reaction to people and to data, and especially now as we get digital imaging, just the reactions to those things, it's hard to bring it down to just a number. So it's important that we have those as well. So why is this helpful? Because we get a variety of findings, right? So you're going to get different relationships among variables, different strengths of relationships depending on the methods that you use. So that's again why Chapter 18 talked about why did we choose a particular method? Because we thought it would be helpful in determining a relationship among variables. Last thoughts here. Kasdan gives you some great guidelines for a well-designed study. And this he's got an interesting exercise that I'd recommend that you take a look at. He does the study as a story, and it's essentially a script, and he recommends reading it by yourself. It's not exactly, of course, what you would write in your manuscript, but it gives you an idea of how to think through the questions in a way that you're literally speaking to your audience. Right? You're pretending your audience is in the room and you're speaking as though you're writing your article to them. So it's really helpful. That's a story outline. And remember, you want your study to You want your article to tell the story of your study. My goodness, I'm glad this is the last slide. Okay, check that out. It's interesting. If you ever want to write an article, it's really helpful. All right, guys, take care. I've gone over what I intended to here, as per usual. Have a great week. Let me know if you have any questions about the capstone, and I will see you, I don't know, sometime. Drop by. Let's do a Skype sometime. Take care, guys. Have a good week.